Welcome to our webinar, Incorporating Technology into the Classroom. I'm delighted to have Leslie Trail, who is a 9 through 12 English teacher at Eagleville School in Rutherford County. She has been a teacher at Eagleville School for 8 years. Leslie attained her master's degree in educational leadership and has been a teacher consultant for the Middle Tennessee Writing Project. She is excited to share information with you today. And please note two things. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the question or chat panel, and I'll be watching for those. Also, this session is being recorded, so if you miss a link or a site, I will send you a copy of this recorded webinar so you can look it up later. And with that, I will change the presenter to Mrs. Trail, and you will enjoy this presentation.
Hello, I'm so glad to be here with you this afternoon to share with you a little bit about technology in the classroom. I hope that you will enjoy and get a lot from what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about me and my background, the school where I teach, and why technology is important to me. I teach at a K-12 school called Eagleville in Rutherford County. We service approximately 900 students. 400 of those are high school, so in the 9-12 age range. I teach sophomore English and senior English. And I have found that technology is critical to be used in the classroom for all types of students, whether it's a student who has ready access to technology and are so in tune with technology that they almost need that to be motivated, or a student who has never had access to technology. They also need to see that in the classroom, because certainly as they go on to the college or to the workforce, they will be using and exposed to technology constantly. So because I see all of those types of students, both extremes and all in between as far as their comfort level with technology, I have found that incorporating it into my room is extremely important for their success, both presently and in the future. That being said, I do not believe that technology is the lesson. However, I believe that technology can certainly enhance the lesson. And when I use technology in my classroom, that is my goal, that it is a way to help students meet standards, to enhance their engagement, and to drive the lesson a little bit better than it might have been without that technology. So I want to share with you today some of my favorite tools that I use in the classroom, and then certainly we'll answer any questions that you may have. First of all, I use technology in whole group instruction, in small group instruction, in helping me plan, and in helping me assess. For whole group instruction, I often will use it to ensure that all of my students are engaged, especially if I have a lesson where I'm having to talk more than they are in small groups or pairs. In small group instruction, because perhaps we don't always have the number of devices that I would like to have in the classroom, such as iPads or other tablet type devices, I will use rotations and allow students to work in groups so that they can rotate through different things that they're using in technology. For planning and classroom management, I will show you some of the apps and tools that I use to help me stay organized. And then I have found that technology is a wonderful way to track my students' learning through assessment, both as formative and as summative, and to help me know by standard, by student, who is struggling and who needs help. So today, as we go through this webinar, I will share different sites and devices with you that I use to enhance all of these pieces and levels of instruction. First, I use the INTERWRITE board, which I've purchased, or my school has purchased through eInstruction. We purchased several of these a few years ago after having obtained a grant. And I use my INTERWRITE board when I'm demonstrating to the class because it allows me to write on a screen and then project it for my students to see. It also allows me to move throughout the room as I'm teaching my lesson rather than being tied behind a desk or to a chalkboard. Within the INTERWRITE board, there are tools and graphs that I can use for my students to have a visual picture of the lesson that I'm teaching. And because I'm able to move, if I have a student who has faded off or is not on task, I'm able to be a presence right there with them. And that presence often helps tailor and curtail any classroom management issues that might be happening in the classroom. So my INTERWRITE board has been really helpful in ensuring that my students are engaged. I also will occasionally allow my students to write on the INTERWRITE board, and if we're working on sentence structure or understanding grammar issues, I have found that to be a truly engaging thing for my students because they want that opportunity to use that piece of technology. And so they become more willing and ready to volunteer to offer what it is that they know. The second piece of technology is also an e-instruction tool called CPS, or Classroom Performance System. These are clickers that you can use in the classroom to ask questions to your students, typically multiple choice questions, and then see real-time their responses. You can also use these clickers in giving quizzes so that then you get ready electronic feedback from their assessment. I often use them as a general teaching tool if we're reviewing a skill to see what my students know and what students need help. However, if you don't have access to the classroom performance system through CPS, then there are also tools called clickers, and I wanted to show that to you today so that you could see how those work. Unfortunately, my Flickr link closed, so I'm going to open that up. I just went to www.plickers.com, and you can see when you're using Plickers, you're going to print out pieces of paper that have been formatted to be the answers, A, B, C, or D, for example. And then you use your phone to scan those answers so that you can get that real-time feedback. You do have to have a set of 3 or 4, however many options you're giving your students for each student to use. Your students don't actually have to hold any technology up. They're just holding the paper. You're using your phone to then scan and get the responses. So that might be, for some of you, a little bit more accessible way of using this tool to assess your students. The next thing I want to share with you is the Elmo. I have a picture of an Elmo on this screen just so you can see exactly the type that I'm using. I use my Elmo to show off my student work, to model writing, to go over assignments, and to demonstrate. I also will often use my Elmo if I'm wanting to project material from a book that I don't have an electronic copy of, but I want my students to all be looking at the same sentence or paragraph together. I will use it to go over assignments so that my students are able to share their work, to demonstrate work. And when I am writing with my students, I write under my Elmo so that my writing becomes a model for my students. If they don't understand the assignment, it allows them to have that visual to work with. There are many, many different types of web-based technology that can help within the classroom, as you well know. Last year, as I began to seek out ways to enhance my vocabulary instruction, I was introduced to a website called vocabulary.com. I quickly found this to be a helpful site because my students were able to, on a weekly basis, go into the site, practice vocabulary that was tailored to them based on a pre-assessment that the website gave, and show that they were mastering words. I did not have access to see exactly what they were working through. However, at the end of each week, I require them to print off a page that shows me the 5 words that they've mastered during that week. I give them a small daily grade to give them credit for that mastery, but then each week they're working on different words through vocabulary.com. And again, like I said, it is tailoring the vocabulary instruction to what they need based on a pre-assessment. The second web-based technology I probably use as much as I use any internet technology in my classroom, and that is Edmodo. There is an app that students can download to their phones or tablets to access Edmodo. I'm going to show you the login to Edmodo. Most of the time, Edmodo has to be purchased by a district, and then you have a teacher account. Once you have that teacher account, your students are able to log in to your classroom. I use Edmodo to give quizzes, to have students submit work so that then I can give them electronic feedback to that work, and also to have a place for classroom discussion that carries us beyond the classroom. My students are very used now to just going into Edmodo and submitting their work, so that in my classroom we have almost become paperless as far as essays and projects that are being turned in. BrainPop is another tool that allows students to watch videos, to do practice assessments, and to get extra practice to skills that are being taught in the classroom. My second grader uses BrainPop in her classroom, and I also use it in mine. It has an array of lessons and materials that are able to be accessed, and I have found it to be especially helpful when I have students who are not mastering a skill, because it will break it down to a more basic level than perhaps what they've gotten in the high school classroom, so that it performs some remediation as well. The Tennessee Electronic Library is a fabulous resource for teachers in Tennessee to access free library sources, magazines, newspapers, articles, and you simply need to be in a Tennessee school, and your librarian should be able to help you access that wealth of articles and information that the Tennessee Electronic Library provides. I also use QR codes in my classroom. Most of my students have some form of smartphone or device, and those who don't, I will use an iPad or tablet to allow them to use the QR code also. When I use QR codes, I make my own. So I am using web pages that I want my students to access through a QR code creator. I use QRstuff.com. All I have to do is paste the URL here, and then it will generate the QR code for me. I then can resize that QR code onto a Word document and print it out. I have printed as many as 6 QR codes on one document, and my students have been able to follow along into some review practices as the QR codes took them through different web pages. I also use QR codes when I'm creating web quests, so that it minimizes the amount of time my students are spending having to type out web addresses. They're able to just immediately go to the site through the QR code.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Sure.
Does this mean that your school embraces bring your own device for your students?
We do embrace bring your own device for our students, yes. We also, however, have an iPad lab that we received, and I will talk at the end of the session about grants, but we wrote a grant and we have 10 iPads, and so I have been known to pair students up and have them work through QR codes, web quests, using the iPads as well, because we have not always embraced bring your own device. But as we have found that more and more students have them and are using them, it has seemed to make sense for them to be using them for our benefit in the classroom.
Thank you.
The last tool I want to share with you today is Remind 101 in this particular segment of the presentation. And Remind 101 is a tool that allows me to communicate reminders to parents without giving out any personal information about myself. So for example, if I want to remind parents that I have a project due, my parents simply have had to certify through a web address link that I sent them that they want to receive reminders from me through Remind 101. I go through remind.com is the web address that you would access, and you create an account, and then your classes have an access code that you provide to the parents, and that allows me to, when I go into that account, send messages to remind them about upcoming events and projects and school-wide functions like parent-teacher conferences. I use many different pieces of technology to help me with grading. The first thing I use fairly frequently is GradeCam. GradeCam, it allows teachers to give a multiple choice test that then I grade using my cell phone or my Elmo's camera or even a dot camera on my computer. My students all receive a Scantron sheet that I print from GradeCam, and take their test. When they're done, I simply hold my camera over their test to see their grade. You can access GradeCam for, I believe it was 90 days for free, and then after that there is a fee for questions, for quizzes that are more than 10 questions. So I currently am using the free account and use this for small formative assessments that are of 10 questions at a time. That way I'm able to get that quick feedback. It immediately gives me reports and data to help me analyze my students and their success rate with the quiz. No Red Ink can be accessed on its own or through Edmodo. I use it through Edmodo since my students are currently using Edmodo, but if you don't have access to Edmodo, then No Red Ink can stand alone. What I love about No Red Ink is that it allows me to choose different grammar skills by grade level for my students to have practice for, especially if I have identified that there are grammar skills where they are struggling. My students can do practice activities through No Red Ink, and then I can assign quizzes. I can make my quizzes short or long, and No Red Ink tailors the sentences to things that my students have expressed interest in. I am able to use Common Core standards, which I also have cross-mapped to my state standards to help me ensure that I am meeting both. And last but not least, in this particular category, I use activelylearn.com to help see my students' progress as they are working through different articles. Actively Learn can be used not only for an English classroom, but for history or science, because I can tailor the articles to what I'm teaching. I have the ability in Actively Learn to create assignments, and I can do that using the bank, the catalog that Actively Learn offers, which I'm going to see if it will load so we can see a sampling. And so you can see that they have an array of featured content. I can choose one of their pieces of featured content that I might want to use in the classroom. We'll just select right answer, wrong answer. I can preview that content, and I can see what questions they have already placed into the article. So here I have a picture and a short article, and then a student question, just opinion. If I decided to assign this particular article to my students, I would add it to my workspace. I would add questions, change questions, whatever I needed to do to ensure that this article meets what I'm teaching to my students at the time, and then I would assign it to my students. When my students go in to work through the article, they are not able to move to the second question until they've answered the first question. And so that gives me the assurance that my students are having to read through the whole article. Once they answer a question, they're able to see what other students in my class have answered as well and give each other feedback on their answers. Real time, I am receiving their responses, and I'm able to look at their answers and determine if their answer was basic, proficient, or advanced. I'm also able to give them feedback about their answers. They receive their feedback individually. My students are set up into classrooms, just like many of the other tools. When I created my logon, I created my classes, and then I have a class code that I use in each class so that they're still divided by class period. Once something goes into my workspace, it shows up here, and this is where I do the work that I need to do to edit the questions, to add the content, and then that's when I assign it. I use the iPad in my classroom, but certainly any tablet I think could be usable and accessible to students in the classroom. I often use the iPad for general research, so just a tool to get my students on the internet. Because we have a limited number of computer labs and computers, this has allowed me to put more research into my students' hands. As I said earlier, I use the iPad for small group work, and then I have an array of apps that I use in the classroom to help me. I have linked on this particular slide a YouTube presentation that you can certainly watch that can give you more ideas about ways to use the iPad in the classroom also. One of the first things that I have begun to use with the iPad in particular is Docs2Go and Dropbox. The reason I use Docs2Go is because it allows me to use Word or PowerPoint or Excel on the iPad, where then I can upload it to Dropbox and have access to it. I also encourage my students to have a Dropbox account so that they can do the same as they're working on the iPads on papers and projects and that type thing. I've already shown you GradeCam. We have an app on the school iPads and of course on my phone that allows me to use that app to scan their tests, to get those charts, and to tie their learning to standards so that I can see again where my students are struggling by student, by standard. Nearpod has been a fabulous tool for students to be more engaged during PowerPoint and lessons. When you set up Nearpod, you are able to integrate different tools that are offered on the internet for your students to access while you're going through your lesson. So if you want your students to have a way to be engaged or a way to assess their learning as you are lecturing, if you've got them linked into Nearpod, you have a tool that keeps that moving into your class and allows them to have access and have engagement that you're able to watch as you move through your lesson. Nearpod is accessible, as you saw on the web page, through any of the devices, and if you don't have a device in your room, you can load just the web application onto computers so that students can still access the materials that you're giving them in Nearpod. I use Evernote for note-taking with my students simply because I have many students who don't know or haven't been taught specific note-taking strategies, and so I use Evernote as a way to teach them some of those note-taking strategies. I use this most frequently in small groups. I also, if I have a student who is struggling with pencil to paper to take notes, will use an iPad or a device to help them use Evernote as I'm lecturing so that they're able to find other ways to be successful taking notes as well. IMEMENTO LITE is an app that allows students to create note cards for review of terminology. It has a bank of note cards, but students can also take whatever terms it is that you're teaching in class that you need them to know and create those note cards, tie them to pictures, and then practice in small groups or as individuals. Class Cards has been one of my favorite apps on my iPad for classroom management. The reason I like it is because I have put all of my students' names into this particular app, and then when I'm working with my students and calling on them to answer questions in class, I use Class Cards to randomize who I'm calling on. My students know that I am randomizing who I'm calling on, and so they've gotten to where they're just waiting to see who's going to be called next. It has made them all be more engaged and more prepared because they know that I'm not singling out just a handful of students. After a student answers a question using my Class Cards app, I can then record if they got the question right or if they got it incorrect, so that then I have assessed their learning through that practice that we were doing in class. TapForms HD is simply an app that allows me to create forms to track the needs of my students. If I have students who are having specific behavioral needs or learning needs, then I'm able to track those so that then when I go sit down with the parent, I can have that conversation and show them that data that I've obtained through tracking what I've seen in the classroom. I have found that this can also be used very positively with students. It makes a very easy conversation if I'm having problems with a student wanting to leave the class. If I just show them, hey, you've asked to leave my classroom this day, this day, this day, and this day, here's the report where we've tracked that. And very quickly my students become on board to realize that perhaps what they're doing needs to change. And so I have found that as a helpful classroom management tool. EDUCREATIONS allows me to record my lesson as I'm teaching it so that then I can link it to my web page or to my Edmodo account, or I can share it if I'm out of the classroom. Perhaps I've been called to a meeting. I can share my lesson that I've already recorded onto my projector so that my students can see and still participate in the lesson. Also, this can be used if I have a student who is absent. They can easily access what was taught, or if I have a student that they just didn't understand and to hear the lesson again would help them, that can be used to show them the lesson again. I use a variety of news sources in the classroom to give my students access to more nonfiction and current literature and articles and nonfiction texts. MSN and USA Today are two apps that I frequently use. USA Today has the articles that you would get in their printed copy of the newspaper that you can access through the app, and so my students have found that to be very helpful in approaching some nonfiction texts. I also use local news apps to allow students to connect often things that we're learning to things that are happening locally. If we're reading a short story that they can connect to a local event, then we'll use that through the app. Of course, that requires me to pre-plan and know what it is that I want them to look for, but certainly it has been helpful. I also use these apps to get students to look at headlines and to understand headings and subheadings and how those can help us approach texts and increase our comprehension. E-book readers are helpful for differentiation, especially if you have students who struggle with reading comprehension. Many books have audio when they have been downloaded into the e-book, and so that audio can help students who struggle with reading comprehension to hear the text being read aloud. And then I use many creative apps in my classroom. When I have students who I want to approach a specific piece of literature and perhaps they're changing the ending, I might use the Puppet Pals or the Sock Puppets app for them to act that out. It's really not that much different from back in the days where we would take sandwich sacks, lunch sacks, and have students create puppets, but here they're doing it electronically, and it's almost like a game for them. Certainly you could use this in any class where they're trying to interpret or understand information, history, English, drama, even science and other classes could use this to help them approach the material, reenact it, interpret it, and show their learning. I have now several featured apps that would be used for different subject areas. For English, I have used Shakespeare in Bits with Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare in Bits allows students to watch a cartoon version of the play while they read the text in the margin. If there is a word or phrase written in Shakespearean English that they don't understand, they simply click on that word or phrase and it translates it to modern English to make that more approachable for the students. My students have said that watching the play while they're reading it helps them increase their understanding and accessibility of the play. I also use audio study notes, similar to what I was referencing with ebooks and audio. If I have a student who is struggling with the text, audio study notes will sometimes help break that text down for them to have better understanding and relate better to the text. For a math class, two apps that I know are frequently used at our school are Algebra Touch and the Graphing Calculator. Both of these can provide additional help and tutorials, and again are giving a student just a different way of practicing a skill that teachers are already wanting them to master in the classroom. Go Skywatch Free is a science app. If you are teaching astronomy and the stars, that certainly allows the students to see something that they wouldn't typically be able to see during the school day. And there are many other science apps as well that can be used to help enhance learning. Google Earth, of course, can be accessed through the computer, through the tablets, allows students to look at different parts of the land and to demonstrate different sections of the land that you're wanting to teach and make that more real world for them and more accessible for them. Educational games also have a place in my classroom. If I have a student who finishes work early, rather than just sitting or moving to something that's outside of the content that I'm wanting them to learn, I can provide them an educational game on the iPad or on the computer to practice and play so that they're getting some additional learning opportunities even though they have finished early. Paper Bridge reminds me of building a toothpick bridge and having to test whether or not that toothpick bridge would stand. I know now that students use Paper Bridge to model out what it is that they would like to build, and then the app allows them to test what they've built before they actually build it on their own. So it's practicing this idea of drawing before it is taken live, so to speak. Bananagrams is a great app for practicing words, for increasing vocabulary, and for just engaging students with words. And then Stack the States has been an app that we've used over and over for geography practice, for U.S. history practice, because it's asking questions about the states and requiring students to remember information about different states in the country. There is a teaching resources app. I like this particular app just because it lists more places that you can access information and get more ideas for your instruction. And then earlier when I was talking about using my INTERWRITE board, I said that there was a way to do the same thing but without the e-instruction device. SplashTop Remote allows you to control your computer, which certainly you can project on a screen from your iPad. So if you don't have an INTERWRITE board but you want that ability to project and move at the same time, you can use SplashTop Remote. I have included the download link here so that you can install that onto your computers. As I said earlier, when I started using the iPad in my classroom, we had my iPad, and that was it. We did not always have an iPad lab. We acquired the iPad lab through the process of writing grants and being granted the grants that we were writing. And there are, of course, many ways to write grants. LIME for Learning and Donors Choose are just two resources for grants. Often communities and businesses in the communities will offer grants as well, and so I would encourage you to talk to different big community organizations and find out if there are any grants available in your area, because that's how we've gotten the technology that our students are using, and I have found it to be so incredibly helpful in the classroom for them. I have placed more apps onto a guest portal. It's guest.portaportal.com/app_for_that. This is just a nice resource of a lot of different apps to get you started. And then one of the tools that I have found most helpful for me in finding more information for technology in my classroom is to follow people on Twitter, whether it's the Professional Educators Association that we're participating in today or other groups, to follow them and to see what they're tweeting as far as technology that's being used, and then to just try it out. Often I will test it, just me and maybe a few teachers, before we roll it out into the classroom, and I have found that to be a very successful way to just make sure that it's going to work, to have tried it a few times before I roll it out to my students. I also, when I'm first testing a piece of technology with my students, will start small, perhaps a small group or a smaller class, so that I can see how it works before I roll it out into my largest class, so to speak. And of course, the very place where you have gone to find this webinar has a link and offers a variety of different technology tools, and they keep that up to date as well, so that we can continue to grow our base of technology and to learn from each other as we integrate technology into the classroom, because students are using it and they're going to use it and going to be engaged with it outside of the classroom. So when we bring it into the classroom, we're just finding one more way to reach them. Are there any questions?
I didn't get any additional questions, but I'm going to change it back to my screen and show you. We do have, and Leslie, I've gotten lots of ideas from you that I will be adding to my own website. We have hundreds and hundreds of free resources for teachers, and every one of these links on my page here will give you links to more links. So I encourage you.
One of the ones that you have out there I didn't get to talk about today was Kahoot, and that's one that I'm using so much in my classroom. But you have that link on your Educator Resources page. Right. And actually, that was where I first started using it.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. But we welcome any comments. You can email me at bethany.bowman@proedtn.org,